do they misuse PCR to estimate all these supposed free viral RNAs that may or may not be there?
I think misuse PCR is not quite. I don't think you can misuse PCR. No, the results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. But it's not an estimation. No, it's a really quantitative thing. It tells you something about nature and about what's there, but it allows you to take a very minuscule amount of anything and make it measurable, and then talk about it in meetings and stuff like it is important. See, that's not a misuse. That's just sort of a misinterpretation. Those tests are all based on things that are invisible, and the results are inferred in a sense. PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what it is. But it's not. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that. That's what it's not.
The test is called a RT-PCR test. It's otherwise known as a viral load test. And the test is a surrogate test. It was developed by a guy named Kary Mullis, who was given the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for essentially inventing the technique of this test. And he said very specifically, you cannot use this test to either prove infectious etiology or to diagnose an infectious disease, which of course is interesting, because if you can't use it to diagnose an infectious disease, we essentially have no idea who has this coronavirus disease. So then they take a piece of one of the coronaviruses, the new one that they found. It has a new RNA sequence that hasn't been found before. They take one of the sequences, which they say is unique to that particular virus, and they do something called amplify it. And what that means is you take in your blood, you'll have one copy of this sequence, and it's too small, you can't find it. So you stimulate it, and this is what Kary Mullis came up with. You stimulate it, it makes 2 copies, that's 1 cycle. You make 4 copies, that's 2. You make 2 to the 20th copies, whatever number that is, that's 20 cycles. And what you find with this test is that once you put it through approximately 36 cycles, then you start to see the color change that tells you it's positive. So if you do 35 cycles, it's still too small to see. If you do 36, you start to see it, but you get false negatives, even though you don't really know which is a false negative because you don't have anything to compare it with. So then you do 37 and you see it, 5% of the time of people with these symptoms, and you say that's the number. But here's where it gets interesting. If you do it 40 times, you start seeing a lot more positives. And then here's something else to know. If you do it 60 times, so if you amplify it over and over and over again, it becomes positive with 100% of the people. Let me say that again. If you amplify it 60 times, it will be positive with everybody. That means that everybody has a piece of this RNA somewhere in their cells or in their genome or somewhere in their secretions. All you have to do is amplify it enough. And the problem is we don't know how many false positives or false negatives there are because we have nothing to compare it to. And if all biological tests have false positives, so if you test 30 million people and you have a 1% false positive rate, then 300,000 people by definition will test positive, and then you have an epidemic. And then if you want to demonstrate that the epidemic got better, all you have to do is lower the amplification cycles to 35, and then suddenly your, vitamin C or your vaccine or your chloroquine or whatever you did worked, and now there's no more people testing positive. That is fraught with problems, and that is the problem. And unfortunately, with every country has their own standard of what kind of cycles they put it through, the number. So you see very different numbers coming out of very different places, depending on the number of amplification cycles that they're standardizing their test to. And I hope everybody is getting the point that this is a crazy situation.
The PCR test, which is the main test, it doesn't test for a virus at all. What that tests for is a sequence of RNA, which is genetic material. And the way they obtain that is also they take the impure sample, basically like the lung fluid in this case, from some people who are sick, or possibly a throat swab, and they amplify short little sequences. And sequences that they're specifically looking for, mostly because they have this library of gene sequences of viruses. But the thing is, if you go back, they've always characterized them this way. So they've never once had a intact virus particle and then sliced it open and taken the RNA out and done a sequence from end to end. That's never been done. What they do instead is they take this impure sample and they look for specific sequence that they've pre-identified as being viral in nature from this database. And then what they're doing is amplifying these short little sequences, maybe 150 to 250 base pairs, and they're splicing them together into this one long strand of 30,000, which they say is the viral genome. But it's actually just this Frankenstein type of assembly of all these little pieces that we don't even have any proof they're related. They could even come from different types of cells or different creatures. And when there's gaps, they're basically using sequences that they get from that database of other viruses that are also put together in this Frankenstein type way. And they sew all those together, and say that this is the genome sequence of this virus. And that's the procedure. And they're testing for something from that, but we don't really know what it is, except it's most likely our own sequences. So that's why there's so many positive results, because they're essentially testing our own genetic sequence.
Dr. Bhattacharya, what is this asymptomatic testing with PCR? But particularly, I think one of the things that's been put out, the New York Times had an article about a month ago looking at some of the test results in New York and in, I believe, Nevada and Massachusetts. And they found that because the PCR tests are so sensitive, that up to 90% of the positives were not identifying live infectious virus. And then I think there's other studies that have come out. I know Oxford's Center for Evidence-Based Medicine says that if you have such high sensitivity, you cannot be there's no guarantee you're even identifying live virus. And I think that, I guess, one, just what does that mean for some of the testing and the case numbers that we see? But then two, it seems to me that if you're test positive with no symptoms with a very sensitive PCR test, and they can't even tell you if you're infectious, we're quarantining across the country probably hundreds of thousands or millions of people who aren't even contagious. And I think that obviously has a huge cost to society. Doesn't seem to be getting a lot of discussion, though.
The key thing about the PCR technology that I think is important for this discussion is that essentially you were doubling the genetic material if it's present, of the virus if it's present, right? If you have a very tiny amount of the virus, or if it's a viral fragment that's not actually that your body has successfully attacked, your immune system is successfully attacked, then what you're amplifying is something that's not going to pose any risk either to you or to others. So you're asymptomatic. The PCRs, you're positive with the PCR. It's not a false positive in a technical sense, but in a functional sense, it's a false positive. Epidemiologically, it's a false positive, right? I'm not going to infect you, even though I have this even though I'm PCR positive, because it took so many doublings to reach the point that we can infer that there really wasn't very much genetic material for the virus present to begin with. I think that you're absolutely right to point out the cost of that when you attach it to a policy of contact tracing and isolation and quarantine. We effectively are quarantining people on the basis of PCR tests, a functional false positive PCR tests, where it will have no effect on disease spread because they're not infectious, and at the same time will impose enormous costs on them.
I wanted to go over the community testing procedure prior to August. Essentially, to get a COVID-19 PCR test done in the community, you had to have symptoms, plus be at risk of having caught the infection. So symptoms being defined as having a new respiratory infection, plus or minus a fever, plus another symptom like new or worsening cough, sore throat, shortness of breath, runny nose, or loss of smell. I won't bore you with the details of what it means to be at risk, but all the expected stuff like recent overseas travel in the last 2 weeks, etc., etc. The key point here is you had to have symptoms. Now, why is this important? There is a fundamental concept in medicine which is called pre-test probability, and this was tattooed into my brain at medical school. And in simple terms, pre-test probability is the chance of a patient having the target disease before the diagnostic test result is known. So for example, you don't test for pregnancy in men because the chance of a biological man being pregnant is 0. All tests have a possibility of reporting a false positive or a false negative, and if your pre-test probability is low, you are more likely to get high false positives and false negative results. So what does this mean for the COVID-19 PCR test? As many of you already know, there are major problems with this diagnostic test in that it doesn't test for the virus. It tests for a piece of genetic material that we don't know the significance of. The PCR test has never been compared to a gold standard because there is none for COVID-19, and that in itself makes interpreting the accuracy of positive and negative results very problematic. But then something changed in August. All of a sudden, COVID community testing stations were opening up again with money available to start surveillance testing. This rolled out across the country with pop-up testing centres looking to test people without symptoms. Soon enough, there were 4 new cases in Auckland from an unknown source on the 11th of August, and then all hell broke loose and Auckland was put into level 3 lockdown while the rest of the country went up to level 2. Masks are now mandatory for passengers on public transport, and most importantly, there was a change from the ministry on how community testing is being done, which was that asymptomatic people are now being made to have COVID PCR tests.
In 2 months' time, we've gone from less than 25,000 tests per day to almost 600,000 tests per day. So of course there's going to be an enormous rise in positives in every state. So what? But here's the great lie. What is a case? A case is when someone gets sick from a disease. That's completely different from a positive test. These two terms are not synonymous, like media pretends. Whenever you hear a news story that uses the phrase, new spike of cases, change the channel. They're lying. There have been no spikes in cases since the beginning. So, if you don't remember anything else from this video, remember this. 99% of positive tests never get the disease. 99% of positive tests never become cases.